thing is I have the great pleasure of introducing Elizabeth Anderson to you in the event that you haven't had an opportunity to meet her and find out more about her. So Elizabeth Anderson is a native of Colorado, sorry. And she got her graduate degree in the University of Denver. And later on in her life, she got a Master's of Science in urban planning at the School of Architecture at Columbia University. She's been married with Craig for 23 years. No, 20, 40. Oh, 43. I lopped off 20 years. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. And they have 3 children who live further away than this area. But in the meantime, as they're retired, Elizabeth was the one that was responsible for finding their dream of a retirement place, our own Orcas Island in the state of Washington. So they've had a good time there and continue to love to play tennis, golf, kayak, and numerous other outdoor activities. That's great. Let's see. I'd like to ask Elizabeth something at this point that I was curious about, and it wasn't in any of the literature I was given. And that was, of all of the places that Elizabeth and Craig have served together or lived together, and as you moved in your career from academia to practice and so forth, if you would tell the folks yourself something about your favorite spot or a favorite spot, and maybe a little bit about why that is so.
This was quite a surprise. Well, I think probably one of my very favorite places is Sewanee, Tennessee. We went there with a 2-month-old baby when Craig started seminary. And then we had 2 daughters born there. So those memories are just so incredibly special. And then when I found out that Craig was selected to go to New York City, I was just over the moon. I thought, oh, this is such an exciting place. And indeed it was, because I did get to do the degree at Columbia, which explained everything about New York, the politics, the history, the architecture. And it was a very enriching experience. And I'd say that's one of my very special places. But then the last 6 years here in the Northwest has just been incredibly enlightening and enriching as well.
Well, thank you very much. I got one more question. I was also curious, that you might be curious, about what it's been like for her to be the wife of a priest and a bishop.
Sure you want to answer that?
It's been an incredible experience. And starting with, just humbly going off to seminary, and then our life in Tennessee and South Dakota, and a year in Columbus, and another 5 years in New York, and then New England,
thing that we would like to do, Susie, I think maybe you can go to the other tables then, that we'd like to do tonight, and thanking Craig and Liz for being with us these 5 weeks, plus the weekend before the series started. It's been an absolute delight. And we were able to find something. Of course, the funny part about this is that you're having to pack up and leave, and I'm not sure where this will fit into that scenario, but you'll just have to find a place, I guess, in Taos or some other place. We actually, the particular item that we are going to give you is going to have to be shipped because it would not be available yet. When Jeannie and I were in Scottsdale early in March, or February, we ran into a painter down there by the name of James Ayers. And James Ayers is a phenomenal oil painter. And he does basically historic American Indian culture is what he paints. And it was actually artists in residence, so to speak. There was about 100 artists there, and they were there for 2.5 months. So we actually got to talk to Jim and James, I think he goes by, but anyway, talk to him and see his work, which is phenomenal and extremely expensive. We passed up the golden opportunity to spend thousands and thousands of dollars, but came back and took a little bit, and one of the things that was impressive is a lot of the Native Americans that he paints are Lakota Indians. So the bell rang, obviously. And I came back and we looked through, he has a website, and we went through the website. And a lot of the, as I said, a lot of the work that he does is with Lakota Indians, and he has them available both in G-clay prints of watercolor paper or on canvas, and we happen to have one that will be delivered to you. A lot of his work is with warring figures and horses, etc. That didn't seem to be the most appropriate, but we were able to find one that we think really does work. I'll give you. I've got a couple letters, and and Susie, here you can both have one. This is it's a letter from James Ayers about this, and also it has an explanation of the particular print, which is called Oglala Offerings. And Oglala is a subset of the Lakota Indian tribe. And so the part that we had included in the letter from those of us at St. John's, all of you and all of us, is we thank you for teaching and helping us to draw closer to our Lord Jesus Christ through this Lenten series. We selected this print entitled Oglala Offerings by artist James Ayers because of its particular relevance to the life you and Elizabeth have had together. Artist James Ayers is a resident of Colorado, small world, and your ministry in South Dakota. We believe is particularly appropriate print since Craig was adopted by the Oglala tribe of the Pine Ridge Reservation and given the name Wandli Tokahea, leading eagle, at the 112th Niobrara Convocation, which was a gathering of the 88 Episcopal Indian churches on the 8 reservations in the diocese. And you can see on the second page a copy, or it's a photocopy of the print itself, and the one we have will be, as I said, a G-clay print on canvas, and you won't need to frame it. It's already stretched, and we hope you do find a place for it wherever you like. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now we can begin.
Thank you. I'm really touched. This is a beautiful gift, and we will cherish it. I haven't had a chance to read all the prose describing it, but the area looks familiar. I suspect it's someplace in the Black Hills, Pahasapa, and I will treasure it. And I say to you, in Lakota, Pilamia, which is thank you, and thank you very much is Pilamia Yelo. So Pilamia Yelo to all of you. That Thanksgiving extends beyond this beautiful gift to the hospitality that you have shared with us for those families that have hosted us, and also just the hospitality here on Wednesday evening. We're really going to miss you. It's been fun. I hope it's been stimulating. It has for us. And this parish church will have a special spot in our heart. For the last few years, I've been wandering around in addition to helping out a little parish on Marcus Island as assisting bishop. And I've had a chance to visit a variety of parishes in the diocese. And just coming here and not just coming in on a Sunday and leaving, but being with you during our Lenten journey has just been great. Two quick footnotes to something that Ted mentioned by virtue of the folks that have hosted us, and then something that Liz forgot to say about favorite places. One of the things that when we finished the first night and went back to Ted and Jeannie's home, he said, "Would you like a drink?" and offered wine, and I said, "Well, Ted, actually, if you've got a single malt scotch, I'd prefer that." So we had a single malt, and word spread because every place we've been, I've been able to sample some great single malt. And not much, it's just a pinch, but I thank you for that as well. Second, when Liz was recounting favorite places, the one that I know is near and dearest to her heart is our farm in Minnesota. So much so that I named it after her in hopes that she would love it even more. Her Indian name, her Lakota name, which was given to her by another tribe, the Burnt Thigh tribe on the Brule Reservation, is Patesan Shkatehuin. That's a long word. It's like German. You just keep adding onto it. And it translates as white buffalo calf woman playing. White buffalo calf woman playing. And there are two ways that names are given in Lakota. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but one is the wonderful name that I was given in an expectation that the eagle being a spiritual symbol and so forth, we want you to be our leading eagle, our spiritual guide, et cetera, as bishop. Well, for Liz, it was a name that was handed down, and this is typical in Lakota culture. It's a gift from one person to another, and the person that gave her the name was the granddaughter of a woman who was named Patesan Shkatehuin. And the reason for that name is that when she was born, her father looked out the teepee and saw up against the sky what appeared to be a young buffalo calf playing. And the light was on it as such that it looked to be gray or white. In Lakota culture, a white buffalo calf is a very sacred kind of thing. So this woman, when Liz was adopted, they dressed her up, and she had longer hair, then did ponytails and gave her a ribbon dress and so forth, and taught her how to dance. Then she was given this name, and it's been very special. The reason I tell you that, I don't think she looks like a white buffalo calf, but she plays a lot. But the reason I mentioned that is I thought, gosh, to just have her embrace and love the farm as much as I do. If I name it after her, I know that'll happen. But you'll notice that was not a part of her remarks, right? And part of the reason is, this winter, you all know what the weather was like in the Midwest this winter, right? I said to her, you know, the kids are going to see all the other relatives. This happens every other year. I'm sure that's true for many of you too. One year they go with the grandkids and see one set of family, and the next year it's the other. Well, we were bereft this year. They were all going different places. And I said, you know, it's been over 20 years since we've spent a Christmas on the farm. Honey, this will be a great time to go and have a white Christmas. We can do a little cross-country skiing, some snowshoeing, and you know, reading and throw a log on the fire and all that sort of thing. So she reluctantly agreed. Christmas Day, it was 15 below zero, wind chill factor of 40 below. And she said, you know, I don't think we're going to be doing any cross-country skiing today. But we had a wonderful time, right? What's that? Yeah, so she's referring to other things now to defer a positive end. No, we had a lot of fun, but watched a lot of movies, read a lot of books, and did a little project in the kitchen, but at any rate. So tonight we come full circle, and I mean that literally. Maybe we've been going in circles. Some of you may have felt that too, but we come full circle tonight in terms of our theological method, which has guided us, the hermeneutical circle. And for the last several weeks, we've been asking ourselves questions with regard to what's this doctrine of the church, this teaching of the church that we call the incarnation all about? And we framed that not only in terms of human being, but also in terms of the cosmos itself. Earth, clearly, and all the planets in their heavenly courses. And last night, I don't know if you had a chance, but up in Orcas, we went out, and it was just a wonderful night in terms of being able to see the stars. But we started with the cosmic, and then over the course of the weeks, we've talked last week and the week before about incarnation in terms of human being, humus, and being having to do with existence. And we've looked at that from a sort of a scientific point of view, Homo erectus, and by the way, you have as a handout before you a poem that was written by, and I'm not sure he's a member here, but he was here last week and will be coming back later tonight, William Alato, which is a beautiful way, I think, of trying to get at this poetically. But we've examined it from that standpoint, and then last week, we took a look at a branch of philosophy known as phenomenology and talked about some of the ontic structures, or ontological structures of human being. Ontic having to do with being. We looked at space, time, intersubjectivity, language, as you may recall, and then also lived theologies or religion, that which binds us together, that which is a belief system, if you will. And so those questions led us from a reflection on our experience of God, our incarnate experience of God, to asking questions about meaning and meaningfulness, meaning, looking at what different people have said, meaningfulness in terms of how that touches us in our lives. And last week I came up with a few truths that I think we gleaned from that in terms of Scripture, in terms of some theologians, in terms of some poets. I have a couple I want to add tonight to frame what we're going to do tonight. But then finally, truth, if it grasps us incarnationally, drives us to action. It's called inspiration. It has to do with revelation, which results in our needing to do something in response to that which has been revealed. For Christians, it's the love of Christ, made known in Jesus, the Christ. And our adoption into a tribe that we call Christian, that is throughout the world. In our particular branch, Anglicans, some 80 million of us, a subset of that tribe. So what is God calling us to do as a result of some of the truths that we have gleaned and been discussing and reflecting on during this Lenten journey? What does this truth lead to? If it just leads to some sort of intellectual exercise, that might be interesting, nothing wrong with that. But we're not talking about an intellectual exercise. We're talking about the Great Commandments, which invites us to love the Lord our God with our heart, our soul, as well as our mind, and then our strength. And the strength portion has to do with the action that we call ministry. And if you think about ministry, a way of framing it in terms of what we've done before is to think of it as a praxis. A praxis. Praxis has to do with the marriage of doctrine, teaching, theory, a number of different ways of naming it, things that we look at and talk about intellectually that result in certain truths. But it has to do with the marriage of theory, doctrine, dogma, and so forth, finally with action. What do we do with it? And the two coming together are called praxis. And ministry is a praxis informed by the gospel, informed by the story that we rehearse every Sunday when we gather in church, informed by our life together as mitakuye as relatives, informed by the many challenges that are set before us in the world. So that's what I'd like to talk about tonight, praxis. And I'd like to do that in a particular way, and you should have before you something I handed out a few weeks ago. It's a very short bibliography with, excuse me, not a bibliography, but some theological terms that have to do with virtues. Do you all have that? You should have. At the top of it is a word with theological vocabulary, and then about 2/3 of the way down the page, virtues, and on the flip side, some other virtues. So I want to talk about each of those briefly. But before doing so, I want to further frame this in terms of our worship. For the last 4 gatherings, we have used different offerings from the prayer book. Last week we did Compline, as you may recall. The week before that we did an order for evening. The week before that we did one of the family services at the close of day. And the week before that I think it was in the early evening. Tonight I want to finish our time together in the context of the Eucharist. A very different kind of Eucharist. If you'd like to see what it looks like, it's not one you use, I suspect, every Sunday. But take a look at the prayer book on your table on page 400. Page 400. The Eucharist, as you recall, on Sunday morning is divided. Actually, the liturgy for the Eucharist is divided into 2 sections. We have the liturgy of the Word, right? That's the way we began. And then we have the liturgy of the table. So what I'd like to share with you tonight is, first of all, the liturgy of the Word. And then after some remarks I'd like to offer in terms of praxis and virtue, I'd like to conclude with a liturgy of the table. And I'm going to ask you to be Eucharistic ministers, all of you. It'll be a Eucharist following this outline. It will be relatively brief, somewhat spontaneous, but will have the necessary parts, the epiclesis and anamnesis, the remembrance and the calling of the Spirit, to make incarnate the simple gifts that we will have. And who brought the bread tonight? Thank you, sir. Again, you made a contribution first night, as I recall. We're going to use that bread and a beautiful chalice, an earthen chalice, and I'm going to ask you to communicate one another. We'll gather in a circle as relatives. It's a fit way of ending, I think. So that's a little bit of the background. A couple of other notes in terms of what you have before you. Several of you asked about some books that might be of interest, and I'm going to really go out and limb here, Ted, Lee. The first couple of books on this bibliography, this is not in any way a complete bibliography, it's sort of here, there, and everywhere. It has to do with a group of Gospels that never made the cut. They didn't make the canon of Scripture. And there was a good reason for that. The early persons who were putting together what we now call the Old and the New Testament had to select from a variety of materials, and they were predisposed in terms of their prior concern, hermeneutical circle again, to make sure that they selected those documents, those gospels, that fit with the doctrine of the church at that time. And that's why we have the 3 synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John, which is really your namesake, and my favorite gospel, by the way. It's a theological reflection. It's not as historical as the others. Luke, probably the most historical. But at any rate, there were a lot of things to choose from. And the ones that didn't make it, for a variety of reasons, and what I'm trying to do is tease you a little bit here into maybe considering this, were controversial, but they really showed the full humanity of Jesus in lots of ways, and the full humanity of the family of Jesus. And a number of theologians, called the Jesus Seminar, have retrieved these Gospels and have written about them. And so one of the persons is Beyond Belief, the Secret Gospel of Thomas by Elaine Pagels. Any of you are familiar with Elaine Pagels? Yeah. A fascinating account of, again, seeing some incarnational aspects of our Lord's life that really discloses full humanity. The second one is the Gospel of Judas. We think of Judas in a particular way, don't we? Especially as we come to this Holy Week. But there's some very insightful things here. All of which is to say, maybe for a Lenten series in the future, you might want to consider looking at the Gnostic Gospels as a way of filling out your understanding of God incarnate in Jesus. And not to be threatened by it, but just to say, oh gosh, there were other accounts, other ways, other information about Jesus that might be at least worth looking at. And as informed and educated Christians, you ought to know what these Gnostic Gospels are about. So, as a possible Lenten theory or theme, you might want to consider that and have some fun with it. Apropos of that is the coming of the cosmic Christ, which I mentioned, the healing of Mother Earth and the birth of a global renaissance by Matthew Fox, a very intriguing theologian. A couple of weeks ago I mentioned something far more classical, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And then there are some books that I have a debt to in terms of some of the work I'm doing on, in terms of a theology having to do with incarnation and the land, to include Minnesota in the winters. Liz. Experience of place has to do with how we have transitioned from being a people who tended to live on farms to now having a very small percentage of that given agribusiness. The second, Coming to Land in a Troubled World, beautifully written book. The third, Country of Exiles, which I think you'd find fascinating. And then The Sacred Depths of Nature. Some of you may have read this, Ursula Goodenough. So if some good reading, and to perhaps expand our understanding of incarnation in some different ways. Commend them to you, and hope that you'll at least consider them. So we're going to conclude tonight by sharing that which is fundamental to incarnation. The body, the flesh, carnal, and blood, the wine, the spirit, that we will take from the earth and offer it in thanksgiving, which, as you know, is what the word Eucharist means. Thanksgiving to God and thanksgiving for the gift of one another. And the earth, our mother. God, our Father, or Tunxia, our grandfather. I like that even better. And I think that's a fit way to bring to conclusion our thoughts. To finally go beyond words to sacrament that literally ground us, pun intended, in terms of the earth. So that's the direction tonight. So where do we go? Let's start with a couple of comments that I think will bring to mind some things that we concluded with last week. And I'm going to hand last week, we moved from a consideration of Homo sapiens sapien, a subspecies of who we are, to some thoughts from theologians and philosophers and poets on the human condition and what we share in common in terms of our humus and our being, what we share in common as sapiential beings, coming from the word sapientia, which has to do with wisdom. We are credited with having wisdom, although we don't always exercise it, do we? But in that sense, we're a specific and very unique part of the ordered world. At least Carl Linnaeus thought so when he called us that. And created in the image and likeness of God, we have been given this gift of knowledge. And you know, if you doubt that, take a look at what's happened. We were talking about this, not about this in particular, but with our soup tonight, about the changes that have taken place in technology, the expansion of information, robotics, some of the new sciences that have come about within just the last few decades. And that's part of the sapientia, but sometimes we confuse the accumulation of information and knowledge with wisdom. Wisdom needs to be tempered by virtue, and that's where I want to take you tonight a little bit. But as a way of getting there, the human condition is fraught with blessings and with curses. Let me share with you a couple of quotations that get at that, I think, very directly. The first is one from Jonathan Edwards. The title of the work that it comes from, The Justice of God and the Damnation of Sinners. Does that tell you where he's going? And I quote, "A little wretched, despicable creature, a worm, a mere nothing, and less than nothing, a vile insect that has risen up in contempt against the majesty of heaven and earth." Close quotation. How does that make you feel about yourself? Lee, "You despicable creature." Ted, "You vile insect." Boy, that's comforting, isn't it? This guy was a theologian, a preacher, actually a famous one, who reminded us of something. When we get too puffed up in terms of ourselves, we need to recognize that some of this title called Homo sapien, that this wisdom that we supposedly have, we forget about, and we use it in the wrong ways. Well, contrast that with a beautiful, simple phrase from Ralph Waldo Emerson, poet. "Every man is a divinity in disguise." Remember we talked about theosis, the deification of human being? Created in the image and likeness of God, we are called to that vocationally, to try to be, not to replace God, but to try to become God-like. That's what virtue is all about, which we'll get to. Or, let's get the reference here in terms of Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 89. And this really, I think, is the essence of incarnation in a phrase. "The first man is of the earth." Earthy, period. We are of the earth. We are earth-bound. As my grandfather used to say, as he would drive me around to the farms, he'd say, "Greg, when you start feeling a little bit puffed up about who you are, remember that our existence is dependent upon 12 inches of good topsoil and timely rains." He was right. We are bound, mothered, caressed, loved by the earth, and sometimes we don't return that love, do we? On the way here today, there was a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Seattle Roundtable, and it had to do with the environment and foreign policy. It was an interesting discussion by a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York by the name of Michael Levy, who's written a number of books about the impact of what's happening, and the focus today was on China. And trying to call us to our senses in terms of how we develop policy, both domestically and in terms of our foreign policy. It was fascinating. So, where do we go with this? Well, if we are indeed a mixture of saint and sinner, and that's what we are, stop and think about it. There are times in our life when we meet those saints that provide an example of what it is that we aspire to, this notion of deification of human being, theosis. And to have those examples is important. Now, I have to tell you a little side. Did I mention last week St. Joseph, the real estate saint? Every night at our meal grace, I'll say, oh, by the way, St. Joseph, help us here with this closing. Now, I don't believe that God does real estate. I mentioned that last week. But you know, when you get a little tense, it sometimes doesn't hurt to return to the tradition and say, is there a saint that can help me with this? It's Joseph, Jesus' father. And not only when you're trying to sell one, but when you're looking for a house, bury Joseph upside down. And then after you become successful, pull him up, wash him off, and say, thank you, Joseph, for your help. I don't mean that literally, but it's a nice little thing to lessen the anxiety. There's a special saint today in the calendar of saints. You know, sometimes these things just happen providentially. So that as part of our Eucharist and our getting started here, or I should say continue after this long preface, today we celebrate a saint by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Any of you familiar with that name? It's his day today, and it couldn't be better in terms of a saint who was subjected to sin with a capital S. And so let me tell you a little bit about Dietrich Bonhoeffer from our saints calendar. He was born February the 4th, 1906. He studied at universities of Berlin and Tübingen. His doctoral thesis was published in terms of the sanctified communion. From the first days of the Nazi accession to power in 1933, Bonhoeffer was involved in protests against the regime. From 1933 to 1935, he was the pastor of two small congregations in London, but nonetheless was a leading spokesman for the Confessing Church, the center of Protestant resistance to the Nazis. The Confessing Church, some have said, was too little too late, but at least it was there in the midst of what was going on at that particular time, and he was very much a part of that. In 1935, Bonhoeffer was appointed to organize and head a new seminary for the Confessing Church. He described the community in Life Together, a work that he has written, and later wrote The Cost of Discipleship. The Cost of Discipleship, which is the thing he's most famous for. It cost him his life. He became increasingly involved in the political struggle after 1939 when he was introduced to a group seeking Hitler's overthrow. Bonhoeffer considered refuge to the United States, and here's the telling part, and he could have had that, and could have been safe, but he returned to Germany where he was able to continue his resistance. In May of 1942, he flew to Sweden to meet Bishop Bell and convey to him, through the British government, proposals for a negotiated peace. The offer was rejected by the Allies, who insisted upon unconditional surrender. Bonhoeffer was arrested April 5th, 1943, and imprisoned in Berlin. After an attempt on Hitler's life, which failed April the 9th, 1944, documents were discovered linking Bonhoeffer to the conspiracy. He was taken to Buchenwald concentration camp and then to Schonberg prison on April the 8th, 1945, just as he concluded a service in a school in Schönenberg. Two men came in with a chilling summons. Prisoner, and I quote, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us. Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us." He said to another prisoner, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life. This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." He was hanged the next day, April the 9th, at Flossenberg prison. There is in Bonhoeffer's life a remarkable unity of faith, prayer, writing, and action. A wonderful description of ministry, of praxis. The pacifist theologian came to accept the guilt of plotting the death of Hitler because he was convinced that not to do so would be a greater evil. Not to do so would be a greater evil. Discipleship was to be had only at a great cost. In the subject of moral theology or Christian ethics, one is sometimes forced to choose between the lesser of two evils. Bonhoeffer made a conscious choice. It cost him his life. But what a wonderful witness. Ted is going to, who's going to read? Jean is going to read a portion from Matthew's Gospel, which was selected for this day in commemoration of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
This is from Matthew chapter 5. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And Jesus opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you." The word of the Lord.
Thanks. Descriptive of the Beatitudes, you all recognize them. Descriptive of the life of Jesus, and descriptive of one of his disciples that cost him his life, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I think a summons, a call to us to do likewise. Well, how do we do that? How do we move from truth to the action that we call ministry? How do we take these wonderful things that we have learned since early childhood in terms of biblical stories and the sense of place and holy space that we experience in sanctuaries like yours, beautiful buildings that remind us that incarnation is also about art and poetry and wonderful music that fills the soul. How do we take that then? And how do we find a way to take that truth and translate it into action? I think it has to do with the life of virtue. Virtue is, in some ways, kind of an old-fashioned word, isn't it? We don't talk a whole lot about virtue these days, but I would raise the question with you, is it time to recalibrate the moral compass and to look at how we live the virtues that have been given to us classically? And those are the ones on your handout. And I I want to just walk you through those. Because virtue, just to quote a couple of theologians and individuals who have given some thought to this, allows us to be about the business of theosis that we talked about before. Attempt not to become gods ourselves, but to become God-like, given the fact that we're created in the image and likeness of God. Not that that will save us. It's only by grace that we are justified. But being justified, we're called to act. We're called to exercise virtue. We're called to be ethical. We're called to live morally and religiously as a witness to the love that Christ has for us, and that we are called to make known to others as Christ bears. Christotokos is the Greek for that. It's been said in different ways. The moral virtues are habits, and habits are formed by acts of ministry. You ever done something long enough that becomes a part of who you are? You don't even think about it? That's what this particular quotation is getting at. The practice of virtue, after a while, becomes who you are in time and space, the way you relate to others. It becomes a part of your lived theology, and many times the language that you use. Virtue is to the soul what health is to the body. Ed, where are you? Yep. So we all are into, and I know you are, and I am taking care of our bodies because they're a holy temple, right? Warding off infection. It used to be thought of as the devil's work. Maybe it still is, I don't know. But virtue has to do with the soul. One theologian, psychologist, described it beautifully when she said, virtue is really about soul making. Soul making. Isn't that a wonderful term? Virtue is a kind of health, beauty, and habit of the soul. Plato said that in the Republic, way back when. A kind of health, beauty, and habit of the soul. It's a habitus. It's a place that we become habituated to, etymologically the same words. And it shapes and forms who we are and how we reside in the world religiously. And you know this one. Virtue is its own reward. Huh? Cicero said that a long time ago. And then St. John Chrysostom, one of the saints that I love. So good a thing is virtue that even its enemies applaud and admire it. When we see something in someone we don't like, or who is an enemy, and they do something virtuous, we are moved in the depths of our soul, because it's soul-making, to acknowledge that, are we not? So let us explore, as saints and sinners, the calling to the life of virtue, this praxis. There are several ways to frame this and to name it, and let's do that now. So take your handout, and let's walk through it. It's the one, if I can find it myself, the theological and working theological vocabulary. Let's talk a little bit about these various virtues, some of which you are familiar with, and then I'm going to introduce you the 4 Lakota virtues, which are parallel but different, because they are from a different culture, a different way of living space and time, a different kind of relationship that is primarily mitakuye-awasi, and also a different kind of spirituality that is consistent with Christianity, but offers us new angles, if you will, into something that can make our faith come alive. One of the things that's so wonderful about studying different religions and cultures, it strengthens our own. We should never be afraid of that, because when we come up against something different, it challenges some of our sacred assumptions, but it also helps us to understand in new ways what we believe. So let's take a look. The first 3, I suspect, are certainly familiar to you. Faith, hope, and charity. Faith. What is faith? It is not a body of knowledge. It is not a set of teachings or doctrine. It is not a dogmatic assertion of what we are called to believe. Sometimes people say, do you have the faith? And they're referring to something that has to do with a set of beliefs or whatever. But faith in its most original form is a disposition, a posture, an openness, a stance toward God and God's creation that is grounded in trust. It is a way of approaching God's wonderful creation and say, thank you, I trust you, I want to be faithful to what has been revealed in creation, to what has been revealed in Scripture. Help me with my faith to become more attuned to that. Hope. Please turn your prayer books to page 861. This is kind of an underscoring of what faith is. I want to comment on this in two ways. I'm going to ask the question, would you please read the answer? The first one. What is the Christian hope?
The Christian hope is to live in confidence in newness and fullness of life, and to await the coming of Christ in glory and the completion of God's purpose for the world.
Another way of talking about it is its close relationship to faith with posture that gives rise to hope, even when things seem hopeless. And we've all experienced that personally, have we not, in our lives? And we've also experienced that sometimes as a church, as a nation. And yet, beyond the hopelessness, wherein sometimes we take all the blame ourselves, which is a form of idolatry, we need to reach out to God and say, God, it seems so hopeless. Give me the faith. Give me what I need to retain that hope. Now, the interesting part of this, you remember we looked at the first section of the Catechism? Turn back to page 845. Catechism, again, is teaching. It's doctrine. This is what we, as the Episcopal Church, believe in. It's our teaching. It's what guides us. And there are different categories. We started, remember, incarnationally, not with God, but with human nature, because we were created in the image and likeness of God. You all remember that? And then we go through all of these other sections, God the Father, God the Son, the Old Covenant, the Ten Commandments, all of these things that you know, God the Son, sin and redemption, the creeds, the New Covenant, the Holy Scriptures, the Holy Spirit, the Church, the sacraments, the ministry, and what's the last thing in the Catechism? Christian hope. Is that accidental? No. The ordering of that is very intentional. Because without that which precedes it, Christian hope makes no sense. It's premised in all of those other doctrines. And so it's important for us to know those and ground ourselves in those. That's part of the virtuous life. Charity. Bad translation. Charity, what do you think of when you think of charity? Get your wallet out, right? And there are two wonderful ways that fundraisers like to talk about charity. And if y'all, when you have here, remember Canvas in October? So it's the one time of the year that Episcopalians are brave enough to talk about money. I'm kidding. We should probably do it more often because money is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual something. Money is sacramental. And if you doubt that, when somebody says, what do you think she's worth? Or what's he worth? What's the answer that comes? It's usually a quantification with a dollar sign in front of it. You get the idea. Actually, giving for persons tends to fall in one of two categories. Charity, the outpouring of love and concern for those in Oso, the money that's being raised to help rebuild. It's charity, it's human need. That's one kind of giving. When you give to the Presiding Bishop's Fund for World Relief, that has to do with charity. That has to do with rebuilding the infrastructure in Haiti, things like that. There's another kind of giving that is called philanthropy. It has to do with making sure that we give to institutions that we feel carry the important cultural values and virtues that we espouse and believe in. When your college writes to you, it sometimes seems like every other week, doesn't it? And says, help us with the new science building, help us with our endowment. That falls under the category of philanthropy, does it not? It's not charity. It's trying to make strong institutions that carry our cultural values and our expressions of our virtues, make them stronger so that they will endure and perdure, that they will move forward and carry us, because even though institutions get a bad rap these days, institutions carry the culture. Without them, we would be in trouble. And the church, in its many ways, Mitakuye Wase, priesthood of all believers, a covenant community, everything, it's also an institution. It's an institution that embodies, makes incarnate virtue. A better translation is love. But the problem with that translation, it gets so mucky. What kind of love? You know, we're not talking about romantic love here. Now, we're not even talking about brotherly love. We're talking about agape. The love that wills the best for the other. It's not selfish. It's self-giving. It's sacrificial. It's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's an example of agape. Faith, hope, and love. And which of these is the greatest? So how are you exercising that virtue in your life with others? And you know what? That virtue in your life for yourself. It's sometimes far easier to love others than it is self, isn't it? Now, there are some people I know, none of you here, who have a little too much love for self. But generally speaking, we as Christians especially, in the spirit of Jonathan Edwards, you vile worms, we're pretty hard on ourselves. And sometimes we, as someone once said, we're our own worst critic, eh? So those are the theological virtues. And the love of the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, that's virtue. Strength, which has to do with mind. And it's to love the Lord your God. To love the Lord your God through the exercise of virtue in these different aspects of spirit, soul, and body. And your neighbor as yourself. Well, friends, it's hard to love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love yourself. Some of the great psychologists have said that. The one that speaks to me is C.G. Jung. We've got to come to grips with the evil, the shadow side, all of those things that separate us from one another and separate us from ourselves. And we have to learn how to embrace that so we can transform it through virtuous living, not deny it. The next four are the cardinal virtues, which, turn to page 305 in the Book of Common Prayer. I always love to reference these things by saying it's part of our tradition. And that's what the Book of Common Prayer is. It's tradition. Traditio, as the fiddler on the roof sings it. Huh? It's a part of who we are. We celebrate it. We sing it. We live it. Page 305. What is justice in terms of our understanding of it? Theologically. Well, it's many things legally. But theologically, on page 305, you or your godparents made a pledge that you would practice the virtue of justice. Page 305, 1, 2, 3 questions down. Actually, it's the last one. So I'm going to ask you, would you respond? Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being?
I will, God.
That's the essence of it. Let justice roll down. Martin Luther King Jr. was probably for me a theologian who spoke as a prophet with such clarity about the call for us, not just as a church, but as a nation, to be a just society. Justice. And you can't exercise justice, or you can't be a loving person if justice is not a part of it. Temperance. Aristotle said, when asked the question, what is happiness? One said he said moderation. All things in moderation. It's about temperance. It's about holding a balance. It's about being balanced. This is a hard one because it's one of the, it's the opposite on the next page of sin. See that under the 7 Catholic virtues and corresponding sins? The opposite of temperance is gluttony. Excess. Now, I'm not talking about just the fact that we have been called a nation that suffers from too much obesity. I'm talking about also the fact that we need to be temperate in terms of other aspects of our life. The man or woman whose vocation takes precedence over everything else and forgets how to be temperate in terms of balancing that with family. The person who becomes such a religious fanatic that they sort of miss relationships because they're all premised with rules that person may require of the relationship. Maybe that person's like that. I had a colleague who will go unnamed on the faculty one time, who was always so damn right that he forgot how to love. You know what I mean? You ever run across those people? They are just, this is the way it is, and if you don't agree with me, I can not only accept you, I just can't love you. Well, it's the balance. It's being open. Not doing away with the deep commitments in our life, but moderation in all things, Aristotle said. No supersizing. You may not like the former mayor of New York, but I think he was onto something good. Fortitude. Fortitude. Sticking with it. Not giving up. And having the courage, undergirded by courage to do so. Again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a great example here. And I found much of this, and I do find much of it, in experiences of different culture, not only Lakota culture, but others as well, where we have lessons in prudence. Prudence, not being prudish, but being prudent, being wise. It's a part of the sapientia. It's a part of a wisdom that we know kind of, it's not too unlike temperance. We know the right balance. We know when to introduce the right kinds of helps in terms of our relationships with other. We know how to be prudent. The cardinal sins are deadly sins, as they were referred to. You know, there's nothing like the warm sins. There's nothing like the warm sins. We really get excited about lust, don't we? Think of the fascination. I mean, just look at the movie industry and how it just capitalizes on that, and we're drawn to it. Gluttony, we've talked about. Greed. the recent spate of movies about Wall Street. Anybody here see The Wolf of Wall Street? Whoa, you can get by the language. Every other word, the F word. But the greed so out of control that it defines people and becomes just something awful. Sloth, a nice name for laziness. Wrath, anger, uncontrolled anger. I was counseling with a couple that I officiated at their marriage this past weekend on Orcas, and I said there are three things that we need to talk about. And they'd done some pre-marriage counseling, but I said, I want a little chance to get to know you too. And I said, the three things that hurt marriages the most are lack of communication. Number two, financial problems. And third, sex. I said, so let's talk about each. And I don't need to know what you do in bed, I just want to talk about how you relate to one another, because all three of those things are related. And one of the things I mentioned, I said, don't let the sun go down in your anger. You've all heard that one. It's appropriate at times to be angry. It says so in the Bible. But righteous indignation, call it what you want, but just anger that can't be controlled is not only hurtful of others, but hurtful of the self. Envy. Who isn't, in the old days we used to call that covetousness. Thou shalt not covet. Same thing. The opposite of that, if you look down below, is kindness. And then finally, pride, which is the root of all sin. It's what got Adam and Eve in trouble, because pride is thinking not in terms of theosis, like we can become more like God, but thinking that maybe we can do a better job than God does. Sin, in its original meaning, did not have to do with a series of acts or misbehaviors. Etymologically, it has to do with separation. Separation. Separation from God, separation from ourselves. There's some interesting things that the psychological community has done with that. And separation from one another. When we separate, the circle is broken. When we separate, the wholeness that we achieve in terms of our common calling as Christians is lost. The opposite, interestingly, is the basis of who we are as human beings. Humility, humus, remembering that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. Not getting too puffed up, as my grandfather said, and remember from whence you came and to where you will return. Despite all the evidence and advances in medical science, it's there. It's waiting for us at some point in time. The Lakota virtues, I'd like to spend a little time on these. Ooh, not too much time. And beg your indulgence as we move into the Eucharist. There are four that I found very interesting in that they are slightly different from the virtues that we've just rehearsed in terms of the theological and the cardinal virtues, but yet I think they mesh beautifully, but call us to something a little different. The first is generosity. I've experienced that with you here, the wonderful gift. Gift giving is a big part of Lakota culture. It is expected when you come to someone's home that a gift will be provided. And generosity, many Lakota people say, is the basis for building community. It's giving what you have away. At the anniversary of the death of someone, there's called a giveaway. And all people in the community gather for a memorial feast at the graveside, at the cemetery. Food offerings are put on the grave, and then there's a giveaway. This is true of other cultures besides Lakota culture. You're all probably familiar with that. Gifts are given to the family, but during the period of mourning for the 1 year after the death of the little loved one, gifts are prepared by the family to give to the community. It's all about generosity. At a deep level, it recognizes our interdependence on one another, and that we need to share what we have with others. Not only because it makes you feel good, but because it's essential to community. Wisdom. The white buffalo calf woman symbolizes it, as does my wife Liz. It's the wisdom Sophia. It's the wisdom of not over Tushila, grandfather, but wisdom in terms of the Trinity is normally grounded in the Holy Spirit. Missing in much of early Christian theology was the feminine. And if you look at Lakota culture, the one who comes bearing the pipe, the sacred pipe, is a woman, a young buffalo calf-laden woman who is bearing a sacrament, the smoking of the pipe. That kind of wisdom, which is not a part of the other virtues that we normally, it's the taking of knowledge and information and allowing some expression of its end. You know, the information explosion, we have too much information, we don't know what to do with it sometimes, and it hurts us, not only helps us. Perseverance versus instant gratification in our culture. We want it now. And when we dial up that little instrument I just heard, we want a response immediately, don't we? And when you email something, how can it take so long? Well, it's only been 5 minutes, but we want a lot of immediate response to the questions that we have. We want instant gratification, and in Lakota culture, perseverance. These people have persevered for well over 100 years, enduring the suffering and the pain that it comes from being a second nation within a nation, the injustices that have been perpetuated, violation of treaty rights. I could go on. We don't get to preaching here, so I'll stop. You all know what I'm talking about. And then courage. The Lakota people, unlike the many tribes here, the Lakota people were not so much farmers or persons who did fishing, because it's hard to, there are a few fish in the Columbia, or I mean in the Missouri River. They were hunters and they were warriors. That was what the culture was all about. The men followed the buffalo, they hunted the buffalo, they used the buffalo, and they were warriors, and they were courageous. And they had to be. And one of the interesting things that they did as a testimony to this particular virtue was counting coup. Have you ever heard that term used? Yeah, it has to do with when you become a brave. Notice the association here, which is a young warrior. You have to prove your courage by counting coup. And what that is finding an enemy and not killing the enemy, but touching the enemy and then escaping. It takes courage to do that. And then one is given the title of one who is brave. Virtuous living, not out of date, something that we need to practice, something that we need to revisit in our own lives. And I think in an age and a time where there's a lot of self-indulgence, taking care of my needs, my concerns, the virtues, theological, cardinal, and the code virtues remind us of our call to be incarnate examples of God's love made known to us. So let's conclude in that spirit by making Eucharist. Would you please stand and gather in a circle?